I never considered myself much of a social butterfly. Life in a small town suited me, quiet, predictable, and far from the chaos of the city. My wife Emily and I moved here 3 years ago, captivated by how the locals greeted you by name, how the surrounding woods seemed ancient and comforting all at once. That life shattered the day she disappeared. It started like any other morning. Emily kissed me goodbye before heading off on her usual jog. When she didn't come back an hour later, I told myself she must have run into a friend or decided to extend her route. But as twilight fell and she still hadn't returned, dread took hold. In the days that followed, I combed every street and trail in town, hoping to find any sign of her. My pleas to the local police led nowhere. There were no clear leads, no immediate evidence. During that desperate time, my neighbor, Mr. Hartwell, offered an unexpected lifeline. A retired 5-star chef, he'd built a lavish mansion near the outskirts, complete with tall iron gates and gardens you might see in an old Gothic novel. I'd scarcely exchanged more than a few words with him before, but once Emily vanished, he began inviting me over for dinner. "You need proper meals," he'd say gently, his refined gray eyes full of concern. "Grief can devour you if you don't take care of yourself." Despite my reservations, I relented. Cooking anything felt impossible. My mind was too caught up in thoughts of Emily, where she might be, whether she was hurt or worse. Hartwell's dinners, however, provided a brief refuge. He would serve dishes so flavorful, it felt like they carved through my numbness. One night, he presented barbecued meat that practically disintegrated on my tongue, paired with a tangy sauce that made my taste buds surge back to life for the first time in weeks. When I asked what it was, Hartwell merely smiled. "An old family recipe," he replied, deflecting further questions with graceful charm. "I'm glad you enjoy it." Over time, though, subtle details gnawed at me. I once spotted scratch marks on the doorframe leading into his mansion. Long, thin grooves like someone had dragged their fingernails against the wood. Another evening, as I passed by the side of his house, I caught a pungent odor that made my stomach clench. Something metallic and raw. When I asked him about it, he laughed quietly and said, "My cooking experiments can get a bit intense. I apologize if the smell drifted your way." Then, late one night, a message appeared on my phone from an unknown number. "Don't trust Hartwell." That was all. By morning, the number had gone out of service. I was torn. Hartwell had been kind to me, never pushing or prying, only providing meals and a listening ear when I needed one. Yet the text and the strange clues, scratch marks, odd smells, lodged in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. A few days later, I accepted yet another dinner invitation. As he cleared the table, I noticed that heavy, keypad-secured door in the hallway leading off the kitchen. I found myself staring at it, unease prickling the back of my neck. Hartwell gave a disarming shrug. "Some things are best kept locked away," he said, smiling as though it were a joke, but something about his tone made my blood run cold. That same evening, just before I left, my gaze drifted to the floor near the door, and there it was, a broken fingernail. The glossy coral color made me freeze in place. Emily's favorite polish had been coral pink. My pulse hammered as I bent down, dread gripping me. It was fresh, like it had been torn off only recently. My chest constricted. I couldn't prove it was hers, but I couldn't ignore the possibility. I confronted Hartwell with a trembling voice. "Where did this come from?" He glanced at the fingernail, then gently took it from my hand. His expression never faltered. "I have no idea," he said. "Could be from one of the guests I used to entertain. Or perhaps it got tracked in from outside." His dismissive calm made my stomach twist, but I had no concrete evidence to accuse him of anything. So I left, my mind racing. That night, sleep eluded me. The fingernail and the locked door consumed my thoughts. If Hartwell was innocent, why so many strange details? Why the locked door? And if I was wrong? Well, the message on my phone suggested I might not be. I needed to know what he was hiding behind that door. I needed to see for myself. Waiting until his mansion went dark, I slipped past the iron gate, using a small gap I'd noticed earlier in the hedge line. My hands shook as I wedged open a side window. The house was silent, enveloped in shadows broken only by my weak flashlight beam. I headed straight for the keypad-secured door. That was my goal. My answer had to be there. By sheer luck, I found a notepad on the counter. Tilting it under my phone's light, I discerned faint indentations. 7294. My heart thrummed as I typed them into the keypad. A soft beep. Then the lock clicked open. A narrow staircase curved downward, the temperature dropping with each step. A sour, coppery scent thickened the air. At the bottom, I flicked on a single overhead lamp. What I saw could have come from a nightmare. Rows of knives, bone saws, stainless steel tables, and a large commercial freezer. It looked like a cross between a butcher's workspace and a macabre laboratory. My legs felt like lead as I approached the freezer. Opening it, I found vacuum-sealed bags arranged neatly in rows, each labeled in Hartwell's elegant handwriting. But these weren't standard cuts of pork or beef. They bore names, some I recognized as people who'd recently gone missing. My gut clenched when I saw Emily's name. A wave of nausea and horror overtook me. Hartwell hadn't just taken her, he'd been feeding her to me. I recoiled, nearly dropping my flashlight. Adrenaline spiked. I had to get out. I had to. Floorboards creaked above. I spun off the lamp, pressing myself behind a steel table. The door at the top of the stairs opened, letting in a sliver of light that traced down the steps. Footfalls followed, unhurried and deliberate. A familiar, polished voice reverberated against the concrete walls. "Ah, my curious friend," Hartwell said softly. "Couldn't resist a peek, could you?" My flashlight shook in my hand. I saw the glint of a long knife as he descended, his silhouette tall and poised. I know what you've done," I stammered, choking on revulsion and rage. "You killed my wife." He tilted his head, dark amusement flickering in his eyes. "Killed her? No, she lives on in you." His words were oddly serene, almost melodic. "Don't you see how beautiful that is? She's a part of you now." A shudder ran through me. "You're insane," I spat, inching toward a heavy cleaver on the nearest table. "You made me eat." "Shh," Hartwell murmured, stepping closer. "I brought you solace in your grief, a taste so divine it transcended all else, and you savored it, didn't you?" "Stay back," I warned, snatching up the cleaver. I could barely steady my grip. In the flickering light, his eyes gleamed. "Don't pretend you didn't crave more. That first bite, that rush of flavor, admit how it awakened something inside you. You'll crave it, just like I do." Anger and disgust roiled within me. My gaze darted to the staircase, but he blocked my path. He feinted with his knife, and I swung the cleaver wildly. Sparks flew as our blades collided. He twisted with surprising agility, catching my arm in a painful hold. I gasped as the cleaver clanged to the floor and skittered out of reach. Desperate, I wrenched free, knocking over a tray of utensils. A carving knife clattered nearby, and I lunged for it, clamping it in my fist. Hartwell seized my shoulder, spinning me around with inhuman strength. His breath was hot against my ear. "Can you taste the memory on your tongue?" he whispered, knife poised to strike. I swung the carving knife in a frantic arc, managing to clip the edge of Hartwell's sleeve. He hissed, recoiling, and I seized the moment to bolt for the stairs. But before I could reach them, the lights went out with a sudden click and the room was plunged into darkness. My flashlight had tumbled from my hand during our struggle, and I cursed under my breath, fumbling uselessly in pitch black. A soft scrape of steel on the concrete floor told me Hartwell was moving, circling. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but in the dark, flight was just as dangerous as standing still. I steadied my breath, trying not to panic. My fingertips brushed the countertop behind me. Cold metal, scattered utensils. If I could just find something, anything. In the gloom, Hartwell's voice drifted in a chilling whisper. "Come now, you've wandered this far. Where's that hunger that brought you here?" My stomach turned at his words, at the horror of what he'd done, and what he'd made me do without my knowledge. I gritted my teeth and slid one hand carefully along the tabletop. A whisk, tongs, knives. Too many to choose. My pulse pounded in my ears as I heard his steps circling to my left. Suddenly a clang echoed behind me. I flinched, nearly dropping the carving knife in my hand. Was he throwing objects to confuse me? Another sound, like a slow drag across the floor, set my skin crawling. He wanted me to move, to make noise, to give him a target. Each second felt like an hour in that pressing darkness. At last, my fingers grazed a small electronic switch. Hoping it controlled the overhead light, I pressed it. A fluorescent glare flooded the room, disorienting both of us. Hartwell stood near the freezer, head angled, knife at his side. In the harsh light, I could see the mania flaring in his eyes. He rushed me. I dodged behind a stainless steel table, heart hammering. The table screeched across the floor as he shoved it aside with terrifying strength. I caught a glimpse of the door, my only exit, at the top of the stairs, the faint outline of the keypad. If I could make it there and lock him out somehow, I'd have a chance to call for help, but Hartwell knew exactly what I was thinking. With fluid grace, he maneuvered so that he was always between me and the stairs. "You want to leave?" he asked, voice almost kind. "You can't. You'll never figure out the new code." I lunged again, slashing wildly. He ducked, deft as a dancer, and countered with a swipe that nearly sliced my arm open. Metal clashed, the ringing of steel echoing off concrete walls as we fought for leverage. One false step, and I slipped on a smear of something wet and dark, blood or marinade, I couldn't tell in my panic. I went down hard on my side, the carving knife skittering across the floor. Pain lanced up my shoulder. Hartwell moved in, towering above me, blade raised. By some stroke of luck, my fingertips closed around a heavy steel ladle lying nearby. It wasn't much of a weapon, but I swung it up, catching his wrist and knocking the knife away. Before he could recover, I scrambled upright and sprinted past him up the stairs. At the top, I rammed into the door. Locked, of course. My trembling hand danced over the keypad. I tried the same code that had gotten me inside. An error beep taunted me, and behind me, I heard him bounding up the steps. The hallway was too narrow. I'd be cornered in seconds. Cursing, I spun and slammed the ladle's handle into the overhead light fixture at the top of the stairs. Sparks showered as the bulb popped. Darkness fell again, and Hartwell snarled. I ducked around him, pushing back down into the basement, hoping the shadows would at least even our odds. My pulse roared in my ears, but I forced myself to move quietly. He was in here, somewhere, and I had to stay one step ahead. A faint emergency light from the far corner gave the space a dim, eerie glow. My eyes struggled to adjust. There had to be another exit, a window, a ventilation shaft, anything. I ducked behind shelves laden with more sinister tools and jars of unknown substances. My stomach lurched when I realized some jars contained what looked like fragments of bone. A footstep. I froze, breath caught in my throat. Hartwell was methodically searching, gliding through the basement with terrifying calm. My sweaty grip tightened on the ladle, still the only thing I had. Then I spotted the carving knife I'd dropped earlier, reflecting weakly in the gloom a few feet away, near a stack of crates. If I could just reach it? I crouched low, glancing at the crates to see if I could slip behind them. One crate was partially open, revealing dry goods. Exotic spices, sacks of flour, or maybe sugar. It reeked of something pungent. Carefully, silently, I crawled behind the crates, inching toward the blade. Each moment felt like an eternity. I could hear Hartwell humming, a gentle, tuneless sound that raised every hair on my body. At last, my fingers brushed the knife's handle. Relief flooded me, though my arms still throbbed from the fall. I gripped the knife, then held my breath as Hartwell's footsteps paused on the other side of the crates. "You can't hide forever," he said softly. "The mind forgets pain, but the body remembers, and you, my friend, will remember the taste." The crates shifted suddenly, toppling over in a thunderous crash. Flour exploded into the air in a white cloud, obscuring everything, heart racing. I used the confusion to scramble away. Coughing, half blinded by the powder, I stumbled across the room, tripped over scattered utensils, and nearly fell into a massive, empty cage I hadn't noticed before. Clang. I jumped. Hartwell had tossed something, a cleaver, and it struck a metal counter just to my left. He was hurting me, like a predator, cornering prey. I needed a better plan than just running in circles. My eyes burned as flour dust clung to my lashes, but I pressed on, searching for any advantage. Then my gaze fell on the freezers lining the far wall. If I could lure him close and somehow trap him. "Hartwell," I rasped, circling around. "Where's Emily's ring?" It was the first thing that popped into my head, a desperate ploy to rile him. He laughed, low and eerie. "Perhaps I kept it as a keepsake. Perhaps it's inside you." I fought the wave of revulsion threatening to overwhelm me. "You sick monster!" "Oh, please," he taunted. "You came back for more. You wanted answers. Or maybe you wanted that flavor again." His silhouette wavered through the flour cloud, lit by that weak emergency glow. "You've already begun to crave it. Don't deny it." I clenched my teeth. "Never," I spat. Then, gathering my courage, I shouted and rushed him. He advanced with a deadly smile, knife at the ready, but at the last second I sidestepped, slamming my shoulder into his chest. He staggered, momentarily off balance. I seized the chance to grab a nearby rolling cart and shoved it into him with all my strength. The cart plowed him back toward the freezer, knocking the wind out of him. Before he could recover, I hurled myself forward, pressing him against the freezer door with the cart. Rage and desperation fueled me as I pushed, every muscle in my body trembling. For a moment, he was pinned. I brought the carving knife up in a trembling fist, my chance to end this, but he saw it coming and twisted aside, grabbing my wrist. We struggled, locked in a brutal contest of wills. The tip of my blade hovered near his throat, then his knife pressed against my gut. He snarled, his refined composure cracking at last. "You'd kill me, after all the gifts I've given you?" "Shut up," I roared, adrenaline surging. Summoning every ounce of fury, I drove the carving knife forward. The blade sank into his chest with a sickening resistance. Hartwell's eyes widened, lips parting as if to speak, but no words emerged, only a wet rasp of breath. Slowly he sank to the floor. For one terrible second, I thought he might laugh again. Instead, he merely stared, shock flickering across his once elegant features. Then his gaze turned glassy, and he exhaled a final, shuddering breath. I stood there, chest heaving, the knife still in my hand. Metallic tang clung to the back of my throat, blood and fear mingling. My legs threatened to give out, but I forced myself to stay upright. It was over. Hartwell was dead. At last, I remembered the phone in my pocket. My hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped it as I dialed 911. Yet when I raised it to my ear, the call failed. No signal, perhaps jammed by the thick mansion walls or his private security system. I realized with cold clarity that I had to find a way out on my own. I tried the door at the top of the basement steps, but no matter what I pressed on the keypad, the lock refused to disengage. My nerves were shot and the basement air felt suffocating. I tore through the space, searching for another way out. Mostly I found dusty shelves, worn tools, and crates of supplies, until I spotted a small, half-fogged window near the ceiling, almost hidden behind old boxes. My pulse spiked as I dragged the boxes aside. The window looked just big enough to squeeze through if I could break it. Grabbing an old, heavy mallet from a corner, its wooden handle splintered and the metal head pitted with rust. I swung as hard as I could. The glass shattered, shards spraying onto the grass outside. Careful not to get cut, I wedged my upper body through first. The ground was only a short drop below, so I shifted my weight and slid out, heart hammering with each movement. My feet touched the damp earth and relief flooded me. I edged along the mansion's outer wall until I found the narrow gap in the hedge line I'd used before. Squeezing through, I emerged onto the empty street under the night sky. I was out, but the horrors in that basement might never truly let me go. Even in that moment of freedom, my stomach lurched, not just in revulsion, but in hunger. My mind recoiled at the thought, but the truth lay coiled in the pit of my gut like a sleeping serpent. In the days that followed, I found myself in a haze, waiting for authorities to storm Hartwell's property, to unearth his atrocities. But everything felt like a blur of interrogation and pitying glances. No charges were filed against me. It was clearly self-defense. By the time all was said and done, I wanted nothing more than to erase the memory of that damned mansion and everything I'd witnessed. But my nights were plagued by feverish dreams. Emily's face, the monstrous freezer, the taste of that tangy sauce. I would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, an unsettling longing gnawing at me. Food turned to ash in my mouth. Ordinary meals felt bland, leaving me hollow. Then one evening, I found myself at the stove. Pots and pans littered the counters, exotic spices I didn't recall buying arranged neatly before me. My hands moved almost on their own, echoing Hartwell's precise motions. I sautéed onions and garlic in a dark red wine reduction, stirring in herbs that smelled musky and forbidden. My mind roiled with guilt and revulsion, yet I couldn't stop. A piece of me needed to replicate that flavor, needed to know if it truly had taken root in me. Finally, I lowered small, mysterious cuts of meat into the simmering sauce. My heart pounded as the aroma rose, thick and savory, so reminiscent of the meals Hartwell had served. When the meal was done, I plated it carefully, just as Hartwell had done. Steam curled, carrying that unmistakable bouquet, sweet and metallic. My stomach churned. Part hunger, part horror. Slowly, almost reverently, I took a bite. An electric jolt raced through me. The texture, the rich sauce, the memory. It flooded back. My eyes slid shut and I tasted Emily and him and all the secrets I'd uncovered. Guilt twisted into a dark thrill. I don't know how long I stood there, fork in hand, tasting this new family recipe. When I finally came to my senses, the plate was nearly empty. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. My reflection in the window was pale and haunted, yet I saw something else in my eyes, an echo of Hartwell's eerie calm, that flicker of yearning.